The first thing that we're going to look at is the overarching definition of culture. And there's a lot of definitions out there. There's a lot of terms that have been used both in the media and in different textbooks that you may have come across. You may have your own definition of culture. The definition that we're going to use in this class is all of the elements that define a person's society or civilization. In my class, I talk about kind of the definition of culture being in many ways like a science problem. You have these great things called elements and then building blocks known as atoms. And so this is the element culture. And then the other things that we're going to talk about, all these different parts that make up culture, are kind of like the atoms that help to make that particular element unique. And so we'll look at some of these topics and we'll try to give you guys a function but also some details as well. Those elements, just to kind of list them out, as you'll see in subsequent slides, are the 7 elements that you see right here: government, religion, arts and literature, customs and traditions, economy, social organization, and language. So let's take a minute and let's go through kind of these in a little more detail, give you guys a definition of function and some stuff that might be able to help you guys with that. First off, we have government. And government is kind of an overarching element, one of the more important ones that we talk about during the course of the semester. This is a person, or it could be an organization, a group of people that governs a culture, governs a society. And one of the things that we talk about quite a bit when we study government is the making and enforcing of rules or laws. And you can see on the slide here a lot of different pictures. You could have one person like a king or a dictator running the show. You could have a democracy where many people are involved in the making of those rules. You could have something a little more unique or a little more exotic, like a theocracy, like what we see in Iran, where you have a religious board but also an elected leadership, and we'll get into that in later tutorials. You could have something as simple as a chief, a family figure that is given a certain level of respect and therefore a certain level of leadership. So every society has in some way, shape, or form an element of government in their society or their culture. The next element we're going to talk about, religion. This is kind of a twofold one. It's a particular set of practices or beliefs that are important to a culture, and the functions for religion are kind of twofold. They create morals, they try to set a path of righteousness for people to follow, and they also try to answer basic questions about the unknown. This is something that we're going to look at quite a bit in Unit 1 when we talk about the Reformation, when we talk about different religions around the world, the idea of trying to provide an answer, or in some cases closure, to some of these big questions that exist in the world. Where does my soul go when it dies, when my body dies? Why are we here? What is the meaning of life? These are some of these big unknown questions that religion tries to answer. And each religion that you see here kind of represented does that in a different way. Morals are very simply just kind of codes of conduct that people in those particular cultures must follow, and religion is a big part of that. Government plays a little bit of a role, but mostly we're going to look at the implications of religion as well. Arts and literature, this is a very broad element. There are many different categories. Paintings like the Mona Lisa that you see on the slide there, sculpture like what you see with the Statue of David, music, theater, poetry, any type of thing that you guys might have come across in an English or an art class. Architecture can be a form of arts and literature. A lot of my students don't think about a building being a work of art, but it is in many ways. And the function behind this element is a way that the culture expresses itself. Throughout the units that we're going to have in world history, we talk a lot about the ways that important ideas or important thoughts are put out to the community and put out to the rest of the world. And a lot of times those are preserved within this element of culture. Customs and traditions, another very broad category that we're going to be looking at during the course of the semester. Patterns of behavior that is handed down from generation to generation. A lot of times when you have a very diverse culture, a very diverse society, what we call a heterogeneous society, a lot of times this is something that plays into that, trying to form a common history. And that's really what the function of this is, to promote a common history or a common culture among a very diverse population. The United States is a great example of that. Japan doesn't have so much of this. While they do have customs and traditions, it's not necessarily there to promote necessarily a common history to bring people together. It's just something that everybody buys into. But when you have something like the United States where you have people from multiple different cultures coming together, this becomes incredibly important, much more so than in other societies. So that's something that we'll talk about and look at as we go through the semester. Economy. This is, again, an element that we don't get too much into in the first part of the class. Second half of the class, we talk a lot more about it. But this is basically the ways that products are consumed and also produced by a particular culture or society. Now, you'll probably get more of this in your Gov classes next year as 12th graders, but in 11th grade we do touch on some of these basic concepts, like when we review the Industrial Revolution, talk a little bit about Marx and Engels and Charles Fourier and some of these other guys. The main function here, to build and create jobs, but also to amass wealth for a particular culture. And the idea of wealth is very different from culture to culture, so we'll also look at that. Social organization, another one of my personal favorites to look at when looking at culture. This is the way that a culture organizes itself. And typically when we think of social organization, we think of social class, upper class, middle class, lower class, the haves and the have-nots. But social organization can also include family groups, and we'll also look at that as we go through this semester as well. The function here is, again, to create recognizable labels. I know that's kind of a bad word to use here, but it's the way that a culture organizes and recognizes one another, whether that's their clothes, whether that's some kind of unwritten rule, whether that's some kind of status, so to speak, in society. That's what's at play here. The last element of culture that we'll look at today is language. And language, a lot of times we think this is just what I'm doing right now, that this is the spoken word. But it's really not. It's actually a lot more in depth than that. Language can be, verbal, but also nonverbal ways of a culture's communication. So we can put gestures in that category. We can put the written word in that category. There's many different things that we can include in this kind of overarching umbrella of language. And this is just kind of one of many elements that we will look at during the course of the semester. The function here, obviously, is to express ideas, but also make it easier to express those ideas within a culture. And a lot of times these are learned behaviors, not to get into the psychology of this, but they're learned behaviors that are passed down as well from generation to generation. People are taught these cues as they grow up in a particular culture, which may be very different from society to society, culture to culture. So this is kind of our basic introduction to our mini unit on culture, the elements of culture. Hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial. We will have more in the future. Thank you very much.